The election is now 1 week away, Sasha, as we know. The stakes couldn't be any higher. At this point, the polls are solidly showing a Biden win, but don't sit back. Get out there and vote. It might not matter, by the way, if the ballot boxes are in flames, but, I think it will matter if...
It will. You know what? It will matter. There's no ands or buts. It will matter. Whatever Brett Kavanaugh says, whatever... this radical theory of not counting votes says, it bloody well does matter, especially after yesterday.
I mean, tell me now that we're here with Amy Coney Barrett on the Supreme Court, which is something that I haven't even accepted yet. I'm still like in the denial phase of this. Is there anything? No, that's where I'm at in terms of that. Talk about, do you think this will affect voter turnout?
Yeah, I mean, look, nobody who was going to vote for Joe Biden yesterday is going to look at this result and say, oh, now I'm going to vote for Donald Trump. There's no way that happens. On the other hand, the reverse also holds. Nobody who was already voting for Donald Trump is going to look at the fact they now have an even more conservative Supreme Court and say, okay, now I'm going to vote for Biden. It probably, I can't imagine it impacts how people vote. What it may do is galvanize some more progressive voters to actually come out and vote if they were sort of, I can't be bothered, I'm going to sit it out. This may galvanize people because for the next week, they're going to be told every single day on television, on Facebook, on Twitter, etc., that their healthcare is on the line, that, if they have gay children, their children's rights are on the line. All of those things are going to hit home. And I actually think it will galvanize voters to come out and vote in, really, really large numbers.
Sasha, I had in Pennsylvania, I have a number of family members who should, by any stretch of the imagination, vote Democratic for their own good. They were splintered off by, starting a few decades ago by the abortion, and they are what they call pro-life issue. And I asked them the last time they were here, well, if she gets on the court, and now that the court is probably going to, if they get the opportunity, change the law of the land around that issue, is it possible that you would possibly, since you were a one issue voter, switch your vote to Biden since he is more economically on your side, will protect your children, will protect your children's health care? And the guy was like, no. And it was unfortunate because Fox News has turned people who are these one issue voters into people who now all of a sudden believe that trickle down economics is in their best interest.
But but look, I mean, I hear these stories a lot, and a story like that guaranteed to get my blood pressure going, guaranteed to get your blood pressure going. On the other hand,
why can't these people live in New York? They have to live in Pennsylvania where it's important. Anyway, sorry, go ahead.
Turn it around on its head. Let's say I care a lot about, climate change, for example. If I were in a situation where the president who I had voted for managed to secure me 3 judges who were going to, go out of their way to allow for climate change regulations to take place, I wouldn't take my foot off the accelerator. So if someone then came back to me and said, job done, you don't need to vote for Democrats anymore, I'd say, hell no, of course I need to vote for Democrats. So it doesn't surprise me that if those are sort of core issues for somebody, the fact that it's a 6-3 versus 5-4 majority, it doesn't change their mind. They're going to vote for Trump. On the other hand, when you look at independent voters, the ones who, because people who are set in their ways are set in their ways. That's true for a right-wing person. It's true for you. It's true for me. But there are people who switch parties regularly. There are people who sometimes vote, sometimes don't vote. There are people who aren't single issue and they're voting on things, whether it's coronavirus or unemployment. They're multi-issue voters, and those people are reachable. Not only are they reachable, but all the opinion polls show they've been reached, that there is real anxiety and anger about the direction the country is going in. And look, you mentioned Brett Kavanaugh. In the introduction, you started talking about Kavanaugh's radical theory yesterday that, well, we don't need to count all the votes. This is going to be the nonsense that happens over the next few weeks. There are millions, tens of millions voting, have voted already, but some of those votes are going to take a long time to tabulate because some states don't let mail votes start being counted until election day. So, you are going to get a situation where Trump tries to fan the flames and Trump tries to say, well, you know what? I am winning more in-person votes. Let's stop the vote count. And it's going to take tremendous pressure to not have that happen, because you are going to have at least some members of the Supreme Court willing to entertain this idea. You know what? We stop the vote count. We just sort of clean it up. We do a sort of quick rush job and say, all right, Donald Trump's the president again. And it's going to take an overwhelming popular mobilization. So, does it matter to still vote even after Amy Coney Barrett got confirmed? Matters more than ever now. If you're feeling demoralized because of what happened yesterday, you have every right to feel demoralized for all of about 12 hours. And by this evening, you bloody well better be out there organizing and telling your neighbors to vote again and doing everything you can to make your political voice heard, because it isn't going to be solved by the courts. This is a political issue. This is about reclaiming the structures of democracy in this country.
I hear an echo. Messiah, do you hear an echo? Oh, Alana, you're on here. That's why. Okay. Now that, so do you think that state level Republicans are likely to follow suit in Trump's encouragement of voter intimidation, and how successful do you think they might be?
So in terms of raw voter intimidation, no, that's not. I don't see elections officials inviting militias in with guns to intimidate. That doesn't mean there won't be places where militias try and turn up on election day. Though in actual fact, if you look at the raw numbers who are voting early in the key swing states, election day is going to be an afterthought. I mean, in actual fact, in Texas, in North Carolina, in Pennsylvania, and in Georgia, you're looking at 65 to 80% having already voted. In Ohio, Wisconsin, Michigan, by the end of today or tomorrow, you'll be looking at about 60% having voted. In Arizona, as of yesterday, again, about 60 to 65% of expected voters had already voted. This, every day when you look at the election map, every day another 5 million people, give or take, are voting. So if that holds, and it may dribble off, but if that holds for the next 5 or 6 days, by election day, nearly 100 million people will have voted. So,
and how does that number compare to last presidential election?
There were 138 million people who voted. So if you get north of 100 million voting before election day, even if you have massively increased voter turnout, which is possible, let's say you take it up from 138 million to 150 million, you're still looking at the fact that maybe a third of votes will be left outstanding on election day. But that doesn't really tell the story, because if you look at where people aren't voting in large numbers in early voting, it's in states that aren't competitive. So, very few people have voted already in Mississippi, for example, but Mississippi isn't a competitive state. Very few people have voted in Idaho, but Idaho isn't competitive. So if you're looking at where the map fills in on election day, it's actually a disproportionate number of votes will be cast in non-competitive states on election day. But actually, the next 3-4 days are what's most important for getting out the vote in swing states. And so, that's a long answer to your question. But if militias come out to intimidate voters on election day, they're not.
Most people have already voted.
So the far bigger challenge is, what will Republican legislatures do and Republican appointed judges do if Trump's team realizes that they're trailing by 10% or 12% in all the polls, and they realize that if all the votes are counted, they are going to be absolutely trounced. What do they do if Trump demands they shut down vote counts? And that's a real issue, because then you could get this scenario where Republican legislatures shut down vote counts, try to certify votes based on, a very, very partial reading of the electorate. And then it goes to the courts. And, in any normal situation, the courts would laugh that kind of thing out of, they'd just say, go away. But with Brett Kavanaugh's very pointed judicial language yesterday, it's clear that at least some of the judges are willing to entertain this absolutely insane notion that you could disenfranchise tens of millions of people by simply saying, we're not going to count your votes. Completely extraordinary. So how do you get around that? In states where you can vote in person safely instead of mail-in voting, especially at this point, bloody well vote in person. And if you want your vote to be counted without any, argument about delays, go and put that vote in the voting machine where it is tallied absolutely as part of the on-the-day vote count. Give the Republicans as little opportunity as possible to disenfranchise you.
Fascinating. We've been working on these issues and this issue for months now, getting people ready for what the shenanigans that we are seeing play out. The media makes much because if it leads, it bleeds, or if it bleeds, it leads in the media, right? So the media is making much of the 2 ballot boxes that caught fire. How serious an issue do you believe that voter disenfranchisement is during this election?
Well, the thing about the ballot boxes being put on fire is deeply disturbing, and it's also limited in scope. So as far as I know, there was one in Massachusetts. I think there was one in Los Angeles. There may have been one somewhere else. I can't remember. But it's a handful of ballot boxes that have been set on fire. Now, look, that is an awful thing. It ruins the vote of a certain number of people. But one thing to understand, you're not looking at tens of thousands of accumulated ballots in these boxes. They're emptied and they're put in secure locations every day. So you're looking at a few hours worth of votes in one location that have been compromised. And I don't know if there's a capacity there to track down who was voting and say to them, your ballot's been destroyed, have another go at it. I don't know how
they're doing that in Boston.
Well, they certainly should be if there's a technical capacity to. I guess what I'm saying on this is it's easy to get caught up in things that are horrific, but they're anecdotal. They don't necessarily reflect a bigger trend. We're talking about a scenario where 140 to 150 million votes are cast. There's always a handful of votes that get destroyed in any election. We saw that in Florida in 2000, where there were these, cool things about whether or not a hanging chad where the hole hadn't been fully punched, does that count? There's always going to be on the edge some kind of dispute over a certain number of votes, and you want to minimize that as much as possible. Where it gets really, really dangerous is when political figures, and I say political figures, but really Donald Trump tries to use anecdote to destroy the integrity of the entire system. So Trump's been going from one rally to another saying the system's rigged, we can't trust the vote count, we got to stop the vote count, etc. That's where things get dangerous, because then you basically are injecting a poison into the process, and that's when you're sort of putting fuel on the fire, and you could see violence break out. There's all kinds of bad things that could follow when the president of the United States tries to deliberately undermine an electoral system that he thinks he's going to lose in, which he is going to lose in. I mean, all the polling says he's going to lose. A normal human being and a normal politician would say, all right, the democracy is precious enough to protect the democracy, even if it means I lose power. Trump isn't a normal human being. There's nothing normal about the way he operates. He's sociopathic. And so I think we have to assume the next week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, he's going to really try and compromise and undermine the vote count systems.
What on Tuesday, what's the best case scenario?
Well, the best case scenario, and who knows if this will play out, the best case scenario is that in all of the key swing states, it becomes very clear very early that Biden's pulling far ahead, and that it doesn't matter how you slice and dice the vote, it doesn't matter which vote portion you count and which you don't, that you're going to get the same result at the end of the day. Now, it's not going to be that easy, because there are certain swing states like Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, I believe, and Michigan maybe, that don't even allow the beginning of the count of mail-in ballots until election day. But then there are other states where that's already going on. So North Carolina, for example, and Florida, they're already tabulating votes. They're not releasing the numbers, but the process starts. I believe the process starts. I'm not an election law specialist, but I'm pretty certain that there are a goodly number of swing states where that vote count is going to actually be pretty rapid. Texas is another really interesting case, because they're having absolutely record turnout. By this morning, they had nearly 7.5 million votes cast. Now, their total votes counted 4 years ago was 9.5 million, give or take. So they're at about 80 to 85% of their total vote count already from 2016.
And they've got a lot of shenanigans going on. Just the one voting box for a whole city. I think it's Houston, right?
Here's the thing. If you look at that, if you look at the votes in California, for example, 7 million votes have been cast. They're all mail-in ballots, because that's how California's doing it now. They're sending out mail ballots to people are mailing them back. In Texas, There have been 7.5 million votes cast, and more than 6.5 million of those votes are in person, because people got so angry at Trump saying, we shouldn't count mail-in votes. They went to the early voting sites, even though the state limited how many voting sites there could be. People have stood in line. People have gone to the arenas that have been opened up for voting, and they voted in person. So Texas is another state where they're going to be able to count those votes extremely quickly because they're already part of the machine counting process. So that's the best case scenario, is that you end up in a situation where whatever Brett Kavanaugh says, whatever Donald Trump says, it's clear early the direction this thing's heading. That doesn't mean that's where we're going to be next Tuesday, but that's the best case scenario that you asked for.
It seems a little bit counterintuitive that Donald Trump would say you have to vote in person when a large part of his base are older people who still believe that coronavirus is actually a thing, as opposed to some other parts of his base who are just sure it's not even, it's not even happening. It's not even a thing.
Look, there is a risk. I mean, there's a madness to Trump's strategy, if you can even call it a strategy. And frankly, at this point, I don't really think it's strategic. I think at this point, this is Trump's id on full display. The ugliness, the irrationality of his id is just sort of running rampant. But, if there was a strategy, it was a strategy carved a month or two ago when they figured that an awful lot of Republicans could be convinced to ignore the pandemic. That Trump could basically say, look, this is all a hoopla, it's all a big hype, you don't need to take it seriously, go and vote in person, and then he'll wage war on the Democrats and their mail-in ballots. That was the strategy. The problem is, in key areas of the country, the Republicans need a very high in-person turnout on election day for that strategy to work. The pandemic is peaking. And it's peaking in large part because Trump and his Republican acolytes have basically said, you don't need to wear masks, you don't need to socially distance, you don't need to do any of these things. We'll hold big rallies in states, even when those rallies are contributing to the COVID spike. And now in Wisconsin and various other key states, you're seeing vastly increased numbers of people getting infected. So you're right, because a lot of Trump's voters are elderly, and a lot of Trump's voters aren't particularly healthy. And not all of them, but some of them are going to be fairly intimidated about voting in person in the middle of a spiking pandemic. But Trump said to them, don't vote by mail, don't vote early. So they're kind of stuck, which again just complicates the whole dynamic, because the way the pandemic's playing out is changing so quickly on a day-by-day basis. We don't know where we're going to be a week from now. But there are certain indicators that,
it doesn't look good. Signs point to bad.
Yeah, exactly. And, for Trump as an electoral strategy, it could risk backfiring terribly. This idea, we're not going to vote early, we're going to hold our fire, we're going to wait till election day. He could have made an absolutely catastrophic strategic error doing that.
Let's hope so. Anything to get this insane person out of power, I think, is excellent. People are concerned. They're worried about the time between perhaps and hopefully a Joe Biden, electoral victory and the swearing in that, should be happening in January. What are your thoughts? What would you say to people who are very concerned about Donald Trump doing more eroding of, our government?
Absolutely. I mean, anyone who thinks that Trump goes gently into the night hasn't been following the last 4 years. This is a man who is vindictive. He's destructive. He has an agenda. I mean, a lot of people 4 years ago, when I would write these articles saying he's an ideological authoritarian, fascist, whatever language you wanted to use, a lot of people 4 years ago said, no, he actually doesn't care about anything but himself. He's just a blusterer, blah, blah, blah. And I've never bought that. He is a blusterer and he's a demagogue, and he's, a very skilled demagogue, but he also actually does have an agenda, and he's come to believe his own, BS in a way. So he says these extraordinarily extreme inflammatory things, and whether or not he initially believed them doesn't really matter. He talks himself into believing them. So, he's now a dyed-in-the-wool nationalist. He's a dyed-in-the-wool anti-immigrant spokesman. He's pretty much a dyed-in-the-wool white supremacist. He's a dyed-in-the-wool anti-regulatory guy, doesn't like workplace regulations, doesn't like environmental regulations, and all of this stuff he's been trying to ratchet up and lock into place through regulatory reforms, through executive orders. He's not getting anything done legislatively. Congress doesn't do anything anymore apart from pass conservative Supreme Court nominees through. But he has been changing the way government works through these regulatory tweaks and executive orders. If he loses and there's 10 weeks, and even if he cedes the election, and he could easily do this sort of just slash and burn strategy of endless legal challenges. Let's say he loses so comprehensively, there's no room for that. He still has 10 weeks to burn the system down. Mm-hmm. And so, the idea that the election's over, we can all relax, we can all sort of just assume it turns out for the best, it doesn't work with this. The pressure has to stay there, and the blocking mechanisms have to stay there. And if he tries to, put out executive orders undermining fundamental rights, got to be out protesting, whatever the fatigue factor, however much, we start sort of thinking, God, I'm exhausted by this, until is out of office and until the administration is replaced by, humane, decent, professional, competent, science listening people, we got a hell of a problem on our hands, because very, very powerful people are still in charge of institutions of government.
When it comes to executive orders, it's, the incoming, hopefully, President Biden would be able to undo those rather quickly at the beginning. It seems like selling off and giving away all of our money to corporate interests would be something we might want to be concerned about.
I think there are all kinds of things to be concerned about in that scenario. If you had a scenario where you had this sort of 10-week period towards a transition, there are so many different aspects to be worried about. Everything from, Trump trying to activate his militia supporters, which, may or may not happen, through to really destructive executive orders designed to sabotage the functioning of government for an incoming government. You can see all of that developing. You're absolutely right that executive orders to a degree are easier to overturn, though, not that easy. I mean, if you look at Obama's executive order on DACA, Trump's been trying to dismantle DACA for 4 years without success. Now, obviously, if he got reelected with a 6-3 court majority in the Supreme Court, DACA would be dead in the water. But it's taken 4 years. And, God knows Trump's tried to dismantle it. So executive orders, depending how embedded they become, can be quite hard to dismantle. And the same with regulations, that you put them in place. And once they're in place and once government machineries are responding to those regulations, you can change them with new regulations, but it takes a bunch of time. So a large part of the first year or two of any Biden administration would be undoing the damage, not just policy damage, but the way government functions, the damage of Trump's legacy.
Well, I hope we get the Senate, because then we can do it a little bit quicker, don't you think?
Yeah. Here's the thing: if you had a progressive Senate, Congress, and presidency, the first thing, I mean, you want to build it on solid foundation. So if I were Biden, the first thing I would do is I would basically expand the democracy. So you want to protect the Senate, work towards statehood for Puerto Rico and DC. That's 4 extra senators right there, and there's no reason not to do it. Codify a new Voting Rights Act. At the very least, put the Supreme Court on notice. If you hand down counter-majoritarian after counter-majoritarian decision, we'll expand the Supreme Court. Without that solid foundation, everything else is on sand. So, environmental policy, care policy, immigration policy, it's all vital, but you've got to have a democracy structure in place to sustain it.
Thank you so much, Sasha. I really appreciate you being here with me today. I've appreciated every time you've come on this program as we lead up to, some very I don't know, tricky months ahead. They're calling it a dark winter because of coronavirus, and I believe that it might be dark for other reasons as well, even if we win. So, looking forward to that new year.
Yeah, I am too. And in the meanwhile, we shall be talking post-election, I believe.
I know. The next time we talk, it'll be a whole new world, hopefully.
Fingers crossed. All
Sasha Abramsky, don't forget to follow him on Twitter at Abramsky Sasha. It's ABRAMSKY. Sasha, you can find Sasha's work in The Nation. The column is Signal Noise. Thanks so much, Sasha. I appreciate you being here.
See you soon.
You're watching Act TV. I'm Julianna Forlano. If you're watching on YouTube, don't forget to subscribe. Specifically, don't forget to early vote. That is really the most important thing you can be doing right now. We will be back tomorrow with David Nywert, who's coming on the program. He is an expert in right-wing militia groups. He's going to be talking about white nationalism, domestic terrorism, and all the things we've been covering here. Not to scare you, but, he might actually have some good news. We'll see. I'm Julianna Forlano. Follow me on Twitter. I'll be back tomorrow. Thanks so much for watching.